Hello and welcome. My name is Toby Dalton. I'm the co-director of Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session. So rarely in nuclear policy is there much cause for celebration. Usually it's kind of a bad news sort of discipline. Perhaps in the next weeks, if there's an Iran deal that's resurrected or a US-Russia arms control step that prevents war in Ukraine, those would be rare outcomes worth celebrating. Well, today we're here for a celebration of a different sort, the launch of Vipin Narang's new book titled Seeking the Bomb, Strategies of Proliferation, which was released a few weeks ago by Princeton University Press. The book has been a long time in gestation, probably prolonged somewhat by Vipin's itchy Twitter fingers, but it was no doubt worth the wait. It is a thorough and deeply researched assessment of how states pursue nuclear weapons and the implications of their choices. Lots of research in the nuclear field has gone into why states pursue nuclear weapons, but I think Vipin's book really shows us that the how is just as important, and perhaps even more so from a policy standpoint. Vipin is probably well known to most of you. He's the Frank Stanton Professor of Nuclear Security and Political Science at MIT. His first book, Nuclear Strategy in the Modern Era, is probably one of the most frequently cited post-Cold War works on nuclear strategy. He's also a non-resident scholar with Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program. Joining Vipin today to discuss the findings from his book are two other noted scholars of nuclear proliferation. First, Eliza Gheorghe, who is an assistant professor in the International Relations Department at Bilkent University, and my colleague Ariel Levite, non-resident senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program and Cyber Policy Initiative at Carnegie. Both Eliza and Ellie have worked extensively on past proliferation cases that feature in Vipin's book, and I'm sure we'll be asking him some pointed questions about those cases today. Now, let me hand the baton over to the moderator for today's session, Fiona Cunningham. Fiona joined the Political Science Department at the University of Pennsylvania as assistant professor last fall after a stint as the Stanton Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie. Hopefully, we'll be gathering in the not too distant future for a similarly rich discussion about Fiona's forthcoming book on China's nuclear decision-making. Fiona, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Toby, for that very kind introduction. It is an absolute pleasure to moderate this exciting discussion this morning, and I thought I would begin with just a couple of sort of contextual framing remarks before I turn it over to Vipin, Eliza, and Ellie to discuss this great new contribution to the proliferation literature. So as Toby's remarks suggested, nuclear proliferation remains an enduring and a serious security problem, despite the fact that renewed US, Russian, and Chinese interest in the political and military utility of their nuclear arsenals, which has sort of stolen the headlines in nuclear politics recently. Nuclear proliferation remains a serious and enduring problem, and indeed these enduring. Sorry. There has obviously been a lot of attention in the non-proliferation literature on the North Korean and Iranian programs, the former on whether it should still be treated as a non-proliferation issue, and the latter on the prospects for a return to the JCPOA in the post-Trump era. But of course, proliferation risks and temptations exist elsewhere too, and we'll dive into some of those, I hope, throughout the discussion. So Vipin's first book, which Toby mentioned, changed the way that we talked about nuclear posture, giving us a new vocabulary to describe how different countries use nuclear weapons and the conflicts they face, rather than viewing the deterrent effects of nuclear weapons as being uniform for all states. And I think his second book is going to change the way that we talk about proliferation as well, shifting the focus from motivations for proliferation to the kinds of strategies that states might seek to achieve it. So the academic contributions of this book are many and significant, but the book also has many important policy implications and lessons for practitioners. I'm going to headline a couple of the kind of top takeaways for me. So first of all, that states who want the bomb have a 50-50 odds of succeeding, Many states that stop short of pursuing an actual nuclear weapon are making calculated choices to do so, rather than stopping for technological reasons, or because it's simply too difficult. The second kind of top line finding for me is that the non-proliferation regime and superpower guarantees have been effective at raising the strengths of incentives that a state actually has to have before it decides to actively pursue a nuclear weapons program. The third, that domestic political census for pursuing a bomb matters a lot and can be a key factor in preventing countries from pursuing a nuclear weapon and even reversing their pursuit. And the final kind of top line finding for me is that weak states with no friends, the hiders in Vipin's typology, are the most dangerous proliferators because of the potential for conflict and the crippling sanctions they might experience if they get caught. Moreover, I think to end, for practitioners, the how of proliferation can often be a more important issue than the why, Vipin argues, because removing some of the underlying reasons, whether for security reasons or prestige reasons, that countries might pursue the bomb often isn't a viable policy option, but making it harder or less desirable to get the bomb is. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Vipin to give you a more thorough introduction to the work.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. Thanks to the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Program, especially Toby, for hosting this. This is the first sort of event for the book, so I'm really excited to do it and to be able to do it with Carnegie, which has been a very generous host for me over the past couple of years as a non-resident scholar. It gives me a sort of insight and avenue into the policy world sitting up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. To Eliza and Ellie for taking the time to be here and to comment. Don't hold your punches. Take your best shot. I look forward to your comments and your thoughts. And it's really special to have Fiona moderate this. Fiona is responsible for some of the figures in the book. She worked on it with me when she was one of our students at MIT. So I'll say a couple brief words. I want to keep it short. I'm not going to do sort of the whole PowerPoint slides of the book. I will shamelessly self-promote. So it's now available on Amazon. I definitely prefer this cover to the cover of my first book, and I insisted that we use more evocative diagram. And so I hope everything in between the covers is as exciting. And so as Fiona and Toby mentioned, the genesis of the book was really sort of this observation that the proliferation literature had spent almost 2 decades since Sagan's landmark piece, Why, 3 Models in Search of a Bomb, Why States Want Nuclear Weapons, focusing on sort of why states want nuclear weapons and the motivations. And there had been the security model, the domestic politics model, the normative model, and there have been various configurations and permutations over the years. But the proliferation literature sort of ignored this how question, right? Once states sort of, start the process of thinking about nuclear weapons, how do they go about pursuing them and seeking them? And that was sort of, what triggered the idea of the book in the first place. And I hope it sort of provides fodder for other research on cases, criticize the typology, come up with different strategies, tell me all my strategies are wrong. But just asking this how question, I thought was important and exciting. And so I think there are 5 big sort of takeaways from the book, and I'll focus on that and then stop. The first is, and I'm glad we have Ellie here because he pioneered this concept of hedging in the academic literature. And I wanted to bring hedging, or states that had not decided that they want the bomb, but just a bomb option. And it's related to this concept of nuclear latency that Eliza's also worked on. But it's an important waypoint on the process towards and the pathway towards nuclear weapons. And it's central to our study of proliferation. And we sort of treated hedgers as separate from the active pursuers, but they're related in important ways. And I wanted to sort of unify the study of hedging and latency with sort of the active proliferators that we tend to focus on. And the study of hedging in the book sort of disaggregates different types of hedgers. So formal allies of the United States, which enjoy extended deterrence guarantees, hedge in different ways. I call it insurance hedging. they put the pieces in place in the event they face abandonment from the United States, but also use sort of the existence of their hedge to coerce the United States into enhancing their reassurance towards the extended deterrent target. And so there's, that's very different from a state like, let's say, Iran now or India in the 1980s, which hadn't yet decided it wanted nuclear weapons for domestic political reasons. And I call those types of hedgers hard hedgers, and they're distinct and systematically distinct from insurance hedgers. The second, I think, big takeaway is that the regulator, especially for those states that are deciding whether they want the bomb or just a bomb option, is domestic politics and this concept of domestic political consensus. And the book really highlights the importance of not just security variables and triggering sort of the initial interest in nuclear weapons, but this process of building domestic political consensus that is absolutely necessary for a state to actively pursue nuclear weapons. So I think a big theoretical takeaway after the 20 years of sort of the proliferation literature is that you need sort of security motivations to start the process, but you can't complete the process unless you have domestic political consensus. And highlighting the centrality of domestic political consensus in sort of the decision to actively pursue nuclear weapons, I think is an important point in the book. The third, I think, important, or what I hope is an important point in the book is that there's variation in the active strategies of weaponization. We have sort of the stylized view in the proliferation literature that everybody that pursues nuclear weapons has like a Manhattan Project. And it's sort of, there's strategic awareness of the program, even if there's tactical sort of obfuscation. But these are, essentially all out sprints towards nuclear weapons. And that was true of the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, I would argue. But it wasn't even true of France. The Fourth Republic governments in France were just so unstable that domestic politics was a big impediment to the French sort of pursuit of nuclear weapons in the 1950s. And it was only able to sprint really at the end. So sprinting is, while, theoretically possible, is a rare sort of active pursuit of nuclear weapons strategy now, because the states that enjoy the sanctuary and sort of the buffer, both figuratively and literally, to pursue nuclear weapons without coercive threat from the United States or Israel or Russia or China, are few and far between. Really, and I have Fiona in mind here, Australia may be like the only state left where, if it actively decided to pursue nuclear weapons, might have the sanctuary to be able to do it without sort of preventive pressure. But they're few and far between now. They're historically, I think, in the early phases of sort of the nuclear era, an important proliferation strategy. But really, it's the coercive power of counter-proliferators and the non-proliferation regime, which have shaped proliferation strategies since. And here there are basically two creative options. One is what I call sheltered pursuit. And sheltered pursuit is sort of this really interesting category that I think gets overlooked, where a state basically pursues nuclear weapons under the shelter of a major power patron. And really, it's been primarily the United States, although there's one big exception in the book, which is North Korea pursuing nuclear weapons under what I call Chinese shelter through the early 1990s and 2000s. Even though the relationship between China and North Korea is complicated, and it's not the case, for example, that Beijing wanted North Korea to have or test nuclear weapons, but it preferred a nuclear North Korea to a desperate North Korea, and sheltered North Korea at the United Nations, and obfuscated over the centrifuge program in the early 2000s when the United States, was becoming aware of North Korea's enrichment program. So sheltered pursuit, has been sort of a recipe for success for countries that have been able to pursue it. So, or adopt the strategy. Israel cultivated American shelter in the 60s and 70s that allowed Israel to essentially obtain a sort of undeclared weapons program that the United States and successive administrations were aware of. But the big one is really Pakistan for me in the 1980s. The counterfactual is, if the Soviet Union doesn't invade Afghanistan in 1979 and force the Carter administration and then the Reagan administration to essentially it believed prioritize the war in Afghanistan over non-nuclear Pakistan. Would Pakistan have nuclear weapons today? It's possible and plausible it would, but the road would have been bumpier and would have been much more costly potentially for Pakistan. And so, there are important empirical examples where this sheltered pursuit strategy, which either emerges fortuitously in the Pakistani case or is actively cultivated, as in the Israeli case or North Korean case, is sort of a recipe for success if you can maintain the shelter before it evaporates and acquire nuclear weapons or develop nuclear weapons before the major power patron turns on the state. So Pakistan was able to get there before the end of the Afghan war ended. And that sort of allowed Pakistan to more smoothly become a nuclear weapon state than it otherwise would have. For states that seek nuclear weapons today that don't have the option of a major power patron, and I'll say that this shelter pursuit strategy is still possible. From a policy perspective, it's not as if there aren't potential shelter pursuers out there. You can think of Saudi Arabia, as sort of a quintessential possibility that might be able to pursue nuclear weapons under the shelter of a major power patron, perhaps the United States under the right administration. But the only option really available to states that don't have a major power patron, but which have security pressures and domestic political consensus for nuclear weapons, is hiding. And the hiders are really feature centrally in the book, and sort of, from a policy perspective, because first of all, these are the states that the major powers really least want to have nuclear weapons. The only reason you have to hide is because somebody's out there to get you, and those states have the military or economic coercive power to stop you. And so you're the Iraqs and the Syrias and the Libyas of the world that have really no option but to try to hide a nuclear weapons program, which forces you into inefficiencies, slows down the pace of the nuclear weapons program. But if you can get to the finish line, or at least close enough to it, before you're discovered by sort of your major power coercers, the very threats that motivate your nuclear weapons program, you may be able to present a fait accompli to the world in a way that sort of immunizes you against that coercive power. South Africa is, essentially every hider's dream. It was always ahead of where U.S. intelligence believed it was, and essentially in the early 1980s presented as a fait accompli to the Reagan administration that it had nuclear weapons before the USIC was able to stop them or was even well aware of how far they had gone. So disaggregating these strategies of proliferation, I think, is sort of important, because it's not just these stylized sprinters that go all out as quickly as possible for a bomb. Some states have to hide their programs, and that slows them down. It opens up the window to discover them. Time, if you're a counter-proliferator or if you're a non-proliferation community, is your best friend in dealing with hiders, because it provides opportunities for sort of leaks, for the hider to slip up, and for the international community to mobilize against it, for example, right? So the very threats that force hiders into inefficiencies also sort of create the time to allow them to sort of be discovered. The fourth, I think, important contribution of the book, I hope, is, come for the the typology and the disaggregation, the theory, but stay for the cases. I spent a lot of real estate in the book on cases. It is essentially a purely qualitative book. I really enjoy the cases. I didn't cover all of them, but there are 21, I believe, cases of various lengths that cover all of the states that essentially thought about most of the states that thought about pursuing nuclear weapons. And some of the more interesting cases are some that aren't as prominent in the proliferation literature, like Sweden and Switzerland. And there's a lot of, I hope, material for your favorite cases, thinking about those proliferators in unique ways. West Germany, Japan, and Brazil and Argentina have seen quite a bit of research in recent years. But some of the cases we don't think about because the hedgers that opted out of pursuing nuclear weapons are often sort of ignored by the literature. And so bringing some of those cases back in was a lot of fun. The fifth, I think, policy point is really this question about the future proliferation landscape. I would say that it's going to be dominated, or the prediction is that it will be dominated by sheltered pursuers and hiders, but also hedgers. And hedgers are going to essentially dominate, the initial sort of pursuit of thinking about nuclear weapons in a lot of states, whether it's the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and not forgetting about how to deal with hedgers. And essentially, the theoretical point is keeping a hedger hedging is a policy win. So if you can, in the Iranian case, continue to fracture domestic political consensus for nuclear weapons and keep Iran a hard hedger and away from sort of a hiding strategy or sort of an active weaponization strategy, is not a non-proliferation loss. It's a non-proliferation win in a lot of ways. And pushing an active sort of weaponizer back into hedging is not necessarily a bad outcome. For those states that do choose to continue sort of on active weaponization strategies, sheltered pursuers are going to be sort of, still continue to be, prominent and present. And from a U.S. policy perspective, the relevant question is, there's a price to pay for that. If you are actively sheltering a potential pursuers, do you want to deal with the consequences of that pursuer having nuclear weapons essentially indefinitely, right? And with the Pakistani case, again, here is instructive. And then hiders, of course, are going to, I think, be probably the most crucial and disruptive types of weaponizers and pursuers going forward. Either way, the outcome is disturbing and disruptive to the international system. Either a hider succeeds, presents a fait accompli, and has nuclear weapons. And remember, these are states that are potentially the most destabilizing states with nuclear weapons. They're the ones that the major powers least want to have nuclear weapons. And so if they acquire them or develop them, then that's very disruptive to a sort of a regional subsystem. Or a hider is caught and either a counter-proliferator single-handedly tries to terminate the program, which can lead to potential conflict scenarios, or the international community mobilizes and levies crippling sanctions on the state, and that has real human costs. So either way, hiders are going to be both prominent and disruptive for the international system, and nuclear proliferation is not going away. And so this is sort of, I think, from a policy perspective, the most important type of proliferator to think about, theorize about, and develop as many sort of levers, that we can muscle to stop a potential hider from actively pursuing nuclear weapons. And sort of the take home from this is, why the JCPOA was such a unique agreement. It took an active hider in Iran and pushed it back into hard hedging. It did not eliminate Iran's intent to potentially pursue nuclear weapons in the future or its ability, but it kept domestic political consensus for weaponization fractured and at least bought time for sort of, Iran to forswear its nuclear weapons program or stall out, and, keeping and pushing a hider back into hard hedging is not a non-proliferation loss when the alternative is sort of an Iran with nuclear weapons. And so I'll stop there, look forward to the comments and thoughts. And I want to thank everyone for coming today and for reading the book and hopefully enjoying it and learning something from it. So thank you very much.
Terrific. Well, thank you for kicking us off, Vipin. We will turn to Ellie, but I would like to remind everyone who's tuning in live from YouTube to please think about questions that you might want to pose to our speakers and either pop them in the YouTube chat or tweet at Carnegie NPP on Twitter. So Ellie, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think we ought to start by really paying tribute to Vipin for doing what is not easy to do, as we all understand, which is produce the second time an outstanding academic contribution to the non-proliferation literature. And as you've heard from Vipin, and probably will hear from the others as well, this is no small feat, given that this topic has attracted so much interest over so many years, with so much written about this, including on the phenomenon, most of the phenomena that Vipin is talking about, and making one's original contribution therein is therefore no trivial matter. Only makes us wonder what will his third book look like. But in the meantime, Clearly, Vipin's work on the motivations for pursuing nuclear weapons, and particularly how those shape the strategy, is quite a fascinating undertaking, and one that takes us further in understanding the proliferation phenomenon. I think that academics in particular would appreciate that Vipin advances a particularly parsimonious analytical framework through which he examines the nuclear choices, especially on the course that nuclear weapons and the countries follow that path to realizing the various nuclear ambitions of the nature that he has talked about. So the way I see it, he focuses specifically on three parameters. One is the level of determination to actually get to nuclear weapons, being one of those considerations. How secretive or risk averse they are in pursuing their aims, and the extent to which they enjoy the support or cover from a major power. And by the way, Vipin, we will take issue on your Israeli analysis, because in the 60s, it was nowhere around sheltering. I can tell you that from having looked at but you're right, I think, in describing what happened in the 70s and beyond. But the formative period was actually sooner than that. Either way, the focus is illuminating and defining, I think, often quite an important prism through which to look at the pursuit strategies of nuclear weapons, or at least the proximity to nuclear weapons and the capacity to realize this and the circumstances and so on. The one area that I would pick as something which we may wish to discuss is the premise that I think is quite important in the way Vipin had described it, both now and in his book, which is that the leadership of the countries that are pursuing nuclear weapons are quite strategic, coherent, consistent, and skillful in establishing, articulating, and implementing their nuclear preferences on the way to the bomb. This is a very compelling premise. But I must say that looking at this inside out, whereas Vipin looks at it outside in, and I would argue that both perspectives are important, and comparing it against my own experience in looking at tracking and shaping and carrying out nuclear policy, I wouldn't say is always founded. I don't think that you would find this type of characteristics of nuclear policy evident in many of these cases and so on. So at least the nuclear policy making situation that I had the privilege either to take part in or to engage in as part of the countries that we were tracking very closely, either at home or afar, rarely manifested those policy-making qualities. Instead, it transpired over time that the leaders rarely seemed to know, not only early on, but even later, where they were really wanted to head. They kept on vacillating on strategic and political realities evolved. They more often than not seem to conceal their genuine intentions about this highly sensitive and charged matters. And often they engage even in deception. At times, even those in their close orbits about what their true aims and decisions. Not to mention that how the impacts of change of leadership and strategic circumstances, which typically happen in countries that are not pursuing nuclear weapons in haste, have impact on the choices. So I would therefore say that my impression is that the ultimate result in most of these cases was not what the governments actually thought it would look like, and certainly not when it would look like, and so on. So it's a remarkable contrast here between looking at those programs as they evolve with all of this deceit and concealment and so on internally, and procrastination and vacillation on where they want to go, and the conclusion that Vipin produces, which says there is a much greater coherence and consistency in what they pursue. And one issue in particular that I think is worth exploring is the issue of domestic consensus that Vipin had talked about at great length. I agree that in certain countries, domestic consensus, and Vipin makes a wonderful case of talking about a few of them, this is indeed an important consideration. But, I have tracked, and I was even sworn to secrecy following the Syrian nuclear program. And I can tell you that in the final analysis, it's not clear if there were 5 or 4 people in Syria in the know. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs wasn't in the know. And nobody else was. This was a build, operate, and transfer ultimately project, and so on. In North Korea, maybe Kim Jong-un consults his sister, and maybe he does not, but the program doesn't involve many. Saddam hardly divulged his intentions and his capabilities, and furthermore, in some situations wanted to actually feign possessing a nuclear program, which he'd already given up on. Gaddafi didn't seem like someone who consulted many people, and so on. So when we look at those people and the kind of choices they make and go back and forth in terms of, doesn't look like the domestic consensus in those cases is particularly important, and so on. Maybe it's the conviction of the individual, and maybe 1 or 2 other people who influence them, and so on. And to say that this is not just Iraq and Syria and so on, every analysis that we can see these days about Putin's decision to go into Ukraine or not smacks of a question that ultimately will resolve in Putin's minds. So I would say we need to reflect on whether this perspective of looking inside out and the perspective of looking inside out could produce the same outlook, and so on, which is in no way to belittle what Vipin has left us with. He's left us with a brilliant piece of political science leadership that clearly informs our analysis of the kind of programmatic choices that need to be made, the kind of dilemmas that need to be confronted, and the impact on those on the actual activities that are being undertaken, and how those are changing over time as a result of the sense of the political realities, domestic and external, as well as the technical choices that are being made. So this, and I think Vipin makes a great point there, that it's not the technical realities that are actually shaping the program as much as some programmatic choices that are essentially, at the end of the day, strategic in nature. So well done, Vipin. And this is a great appetizer for your 3rd book, which I'm looking forward to reading as well. Thank you.
So by the end of this session, we're very excited to hear what the 3rd book is going to be about. But to give Vipin a little bit of extra time to think about that, I'm going to turn it over to Eliza for some comments, and then Vipin will give you a chance to react to what Eliza and Ellie have both mentioned.
Thank you very much for bearing with me in my connection. I hope it's coming through clearly right now. I would like to extend my gratitude to Toby and the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie, and above all to Vipin for producing a fascinating book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I have to confess that it actually kept me on the edge of my seat for most of it. Fascinating case studies.
That's the highest compliment I think I've ever gotten. Usually it's a cure for insomnia.
Not at all, not at all. I actually put myself in the position of other readers and just realized that this is actually a piece of political science thriller. Very captivating and thoroughly researched. It was really a very entertaining read, scattered with all sorts of anecdotes that have not really been told before. So congratulations for producing a wonderful 2nd book, and I also look forward to your 3rd book. So the question you're answering is indeed a very important one. How do countries get the bomb? And I think you're providing us with a very thought-provoking framework for how to think about this issue. I thought the 2 tracks that you're describing, the hedging track and then the actual active pursuit track, as you define it, I thought those were indeed the main ways in which countries get nuclear weapons. And I thought the sequence of variables that you described is also one that is very apt and sheds light on the process of proliferation. So it's going to be a bestseller. It's going to be on the reading lists of most courses, if not all courses on proliferation. And I definitely look forward to discussing it with my students for our nuclear proliferation class here at Bilken. when it comes down to the kind of gap in the literature that it's seeking to address, I thought, if I remember correctly, that in the manuscript in the book you mentioned how Scott Sagan, in his 2011 article on the causes of nuclear proliferation, he mentions how one of the things that hasn't yet been addressed is the interaction of supply and demand. And that those two terms are a bit strange in the sense that there is no market for nuclear weapons, but there is demand for nuclear weapons, and there are ways in which countries can get that. So the gist of my comments actually goes towards trying to get from you your reaction to the idea that the various categories of proliferators, but also the various categories of hedgers that you identify, could actually be a result of these kinds of interactions that Scott highlights as one of the big missing pieces in the literature. So instead of thinking about, okay, well, maybe it's the speed at which they pursue nuclear weapons, maybe it's how they do it with a patron next to them or not, whether they are doing it sprinting or not, how covert is the effort. I thought those kinds of issues would appear from the conditions, this kind of interplay between supply and demand. What do I mean here? Well, you will have countries that are trying to get nuclear weapons that are voracious consumers of technology, and they really want to get a lot so that they could sprint, as you would portray. On the other hand, maybe you would have buyers or customers, countries seeking nuclear weapons, that want to do so secretly, so they may want to go on the black market. And all of this is to say that I thought the issue of technology, which is something that I care about, and I know you care about as well, is something that you discuss as not an essential piece not a variable in itself, but it's actually a tactic. You describe it as a tactic, and all the other things are actually strategies. But then in the case studies, which I thought were beautifully written, a big chunk of the discussion actually is focusing on the procurement efforts that proliferators are undertaking. So I would like to ask you if maybe your choice of treating procurement and how countries actually, where they get the technology from, are they doing it themselves? Are they buying it from the market, from the black market? If this was a result of the very wide variety of options they have, because they could do so from multiple suppliers, they could have a diversified nuclear program, they could do so together with other countries and so on. Or do you really think that we can simply ignore technology and kind of take it as, okay, this actually has to happen, without it, we're not even talking about nuclear pursuit? The other point I wanted to clarify with your help has to do with this the issue of coding and some of the cases that you discuss and the specific years that you assign to them. I found that, by the way, fascinating. I thought the histories you provide were excellent, and I really enjoyed reading them, as I was saying earlier. What piqued my interest was the fact that you started for quite a number of them fairly early on. For instance, India, I think, is coded as a hedger before it had a nuclear reactor in operation, if I'm not mistaken, or if it had one, it was a small research reactor without really a lot to do with the nuclear effort to build nuclear weapons. And I think the same was the case for some of the other countries you discuss. So when you define hedging as the possibility of building a nuclear weapon shortly, having that capability, where exactly would you draw the line? You talk about how there must be some sort of an ability for the country in question to secure the full nuclear fuel cycle. Since that's sometimes a bit of a mystery for the country that is trying to proliferate itself, if, for instance, we code India as a hedger in the 1950s, but India actually only gets a reprocessing plant in 64, and it doesn't really know if it's going to get one in the 1950s, then maybe this is a bit too early. Should we also consider other countries as hedgers just because of the rhetoric? And last but not least, what really got my imagination going, what really challenged me, was this notion that the categories proposed were mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So I could easily see how a country that is sprinting is not hiding. But at the same time, India was sprinting, and I would argue, I think you actually argue, that it was not advertising its sprinting to everyone. You could also have maybe cases where there's sheltered pursuit that also goes together with hiding. Maybe the patron doesn't want everybody to know that it's helping another country get into weapons because they have skin in the game and because they want to keep their reputation as a non-proliferator, as an enforcer, up and running. So I thought about these categories and what your theory, how it would change, what you would have to say if we consider how there's actually quite a bit of overlap between the various behaviors that we see in terms of speed, covertness, and overall goal, so whether they are hedgers or actual pursuers. That being said, I think the challenge that you have taken on is monumental, and I think you have done a terrific job at answering this very important question. This book will make a terrific contribution to the literature, and I'm honored to have the chance to read it and also to comment on it and to get your response. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Eliza. So we have a lot on the table. I am going to quickly turn it back to Vipin to see if he wants to pick up on some of the threads of things that Ellie and Eliza have put on the table. And then I will pose a question or two and take a couple of audience questions to bring us home. But Vipin, over to you.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank Ellie and Eliza tremendously for their kind words. And they all raise, important points that I wrestle with while I was writing the book. I mean, all of these questions about sort of the assumptions about strategy, central sort of, means end calculation that Ellie raises. When you go into some of these cases, it's absolutely clear that it looks ad hoc in some places. And to sort of assign a strategy to a state sometimes feels misleading in some of the cases where the intent wasn't centralized or fringe elements. Was it actually a strategy? And I take that point, especially in some of the hedging cases. In fact, hedging is oftentimes the output of sort of this cacophony and chaos about whether a state wants nuclear weapons. And so, I tried to build that in some cases, but there's certainly it is certainly the case that I make this assumption for the active weaponizers, that once you decide you want the bomb and you're trying to figure out how to best go about it, at least the apex leadership is making sort of a means end calculation about how to best go about it, given resource constraints, the external political environment, the availability of major power patron, what the potential coercion looks like. And so, I tried to build in some of the sort of uncertainty at the domestic level, and especially the hedging cases. But there's no question that sort of for the active weaponizers, there is an assumption of means end sort of rationality and strategy. The domestic political consensus variable, as I say in the conclusion, is the one I'm least theoretically satisfied with. I don't think there's a generalizable explanation for how you get domestic political consensus. As you said, in Syria, it's one person. In Israel, it's, it can be a smaller group, but, not all that much larger. In some democracies, it's the entire parliament. I mean, there's so much variation. It may not be systematic. And the inputs that go into domestic political consensus can be, highly variable across regimes. I tried to align sort of regime type with, what does your domestic political consensus look like in a neo-patrimonial regime, right? It's Kim Jong-un, right? But even Kim Jong-un has people he has to answer to. So it's not always so straightforward. And that's I think, a really ripe avenue in the nuclear literature to think about what it takes to assemble domestic political consensus and who the veto players are in, and across these regimes. And it's not all that obvious, and especially with nuclear programs, which even in the most vibrant democracies can be highly centralized. This is a very tough variable, and I was most dissatisfied myself with sort of how do we deal with it. I think it's important. I think it is sort of this variable doing the work, but where it comes from and the inputs into it, I think deserve a lot more attention than it's gotten so far. Eliza, all your points are absolutely spot on. The relationship between supply and demand. I'd hope that this would sort of try to move the ball forward in unifying the supply and demand literature. I'm not sure I succeeded. I think part of the problem is, as you point out, it varies so much over time as sort of the non-proliferation regime and the teeth that go into enforcing it improve. This cat and mouse game between, I may decide I want to hide, and it may be that I can't get all the inputs into a centrifuge program. So I try, like Syria, to hide a reactor. Well, that seems pretty stupid. And Assad paid the price. But, if I try an enrichment program, well, what if I'm Iraq, I play around with EMIS because I can acquire that technology. It's old. It's sort of, brute force, and I don't have to develop all these sophisticated centrifuges. And so the availability of technology is really important in some of these cases. And I sort of, again, make this assumption that I choose to hide first, and then I figure out how best to hide given the availability of technology later. And so that's where I come at it. But it's certainly the case that there is something definitely to be written on sort of, the evolution of procurement strategies, or, the relationship between technology and available supply and the demand side, especially for hiders who don't have, who have this requirement to keep a light footprint. I think Malford's book on this is excellent, where she really highlights Saddam's insistence that, look, you just don't get caught. Whatever you do, don't get caught. And that really constrained what Iraqi scientists like Obeidi were able to do. The coding questions, bedeviled me significantly. I ended up against, there were published dates in the literature that come before us. And the question is always, do you tweak some of them and leave the rest? Or, what's your I decided to sort of be more expansive rather than less. And the available sort of dates out there in Philip Bleek's data set, for example, are much more expansive than I would have probably picked. I agree with you that, India really, it's late 50s, early 60s when sort of this technical hedging emerges. But the date is earlier in those data sets. And my coding decision at that point was sort of leave the dates more expansive rather than less, because there's certainly evidence of the flirtation with Baba in India. And so even if the technology wasn't there, it was clear that he was seeking it. And one can litigate sort of the start dates endlessly. And I sort of made an executive decision just to leave them alone and take the criticism that the dates that exist are not great. And there's always fuzziness around them. In this case, I think it is better to keep them more expansive rather than less, but fully take your point that some of the dates are certainly curious in the existing literature. I tried to sort of just stick with that, but because then the accusation would be, if you make any changes, why did you change this one and not that one? I know these cases really well, so I can tweak the dates, but I don't know this case very well. And then a Sweden expert is going to come and say, well, your Sweden dates are all wrong. So I just decided to keep them as is. This mutual exclusivity is really important too, because I struggle with this. And I think I will defend that they're mutually exclusive. And I think they're exhaustive in the sense that the sort of umbrella strategies are mutually exclusive. I think you have a strategy of sprinting. And in the Indian case, with the Agni tests and sort of the visible sort of signatures, they were obfuscating the tests, but not necessarily the existence of the program or where they were headed. And so I'm willing to defend that the broad umbrella strategies are identifiable, clean to code, and mutually exclusive of each other. Sheltered pursuit really depends on this major power patron, right? If you don't have it, right, then you can't have sheltered pursuit. Hiding, I think there is a sort of, is a hider going as fast as they can? Can you say a hider is still sort of sprinting? Possibly, but I think the sort of the key overriding characteristic is that the hider is trying to obfuscate and is driven into inefficiencies and is going slower than they otherwise would be able to if they had sort of an open run and the availability of all the technologies that you talked about earlier that they could get. But anytime you develop a typology, I've done this twice now, this mutual exclusivity runs into sort of, I think it's mostly there, but I accept that there are going to be gray areas and there are going to be cases that, don't fit neatly in the other. I would say, so North Korea is very challenging to code from the outside. I think I'm willing to defend, and this, I think China, North Korea scholars might and have objected to this, that North Korea was sheltered by China through at least the early 2000s. But when we look at Chinese behavior, and the sort of the protection of North Korea in the United Nations, the obfuscation in the six-party talks, and the running out the clock essentially as the U.S. is gearing up for the war in Iraq, as it's trying to sort of deal with North Korea at the same time. It's hard to argue that China wasn't sheltering the existence of the North Korean nuclear program. It wasn't just hidden, even though there were elements of hiding certainly that North Korea had. But then you ask, where did North Korea get some of the centrifuges? Pakistan. And whose territory? I probably had the anecdote 7 times in that chapter, because whose territory is being overflown by Pakistani military transport aircraft to get to Pyongyang? And if China is not aware of transport aircraft flying from Islamabad to Pyongyang, that sort of flies in the face of everything we think about China. So certainly China was aware, right? And so it wasn't completely hidden, right? It's implausible that there wasn't some awareness at the highest level that something was going on, if not outright facilitated by China, right? And so I feel comfortable with that coding. But I take all of these excellent points, and I hope they're fodder for future research, right? I mean, the goal of this book for me was, for excellent scholars like everyone here to pick up on the things that really piss you off and go research it and tell me I'm wrong. And I hope you all go do that. So we're not talking about a third book because I need some decompression time after this one. And as sort of another shameless self-promotion, Scott Sagan and I have a volume coming out on sort of the new nuclear age and deterrence challenges, called The Fragile Balance of Terror. Should be out later this year with Cornell Press. We'll do another event with Carnegie. We'll rope you all into it. But that's sort of the next project. And then I am done for a while with books. But thank you so much for your kind comments. I really appreciate it, and look forward to some of the questions from the audience before we conclude.
Fabulous. So that is exactly what I'm going to do now, is to turn to some questions from the audience and weave them in with some of the queries and things that I wanted to draw out in particular about kind of the future implications of the project. So I'm going to start with a question from Steve Aoki, who asks, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, does the globalization of supply chains for high-tech commodities, ubiquitous high-performance computing, breakdown of P5 non-proliferation, its consensus, etc., change the balance point for hedges? And I want to kind of combine this question with one of my own, which is about whether hiding in particular is going to get harder or easier due to technological changes in the future. And so I'll put that question to each of the panelists. I'll start with Ellie, then go to Eliza and end with Vipin, and then we'll turn to another audience question.
Thank you. We're having a fascinating discussion, and you've let us down, Vipin. I mean, we have a very strong suggestion for what your third book should be about, but you could wait a while. Sheltered hedging, I think, is going to be the topic of the future, and non-proliferation strategies in this new day and age is what I would want you to write your third book about. But we'll put it aside for a second. People didn't realize that the purpose of this exercise was not just to promote your current book, but to give you some ideas of what the next one should be about. But now to the questions that they come from the audience. There is clearly a new technological reality. And the technological reality that Steve Aoki is talking about is one part of that, in terms of the peripheral technology that he's talking about that facilitates development of nuclear weapons with more things that are available on the market. So one thing that we've learned, not just from the North Korean program, but the pace at which Iran progressed, was how much they were able to put their hands on the real technical weaponization blueprints and so on. And then you add to this all of the other technologies, the computing technologies and other type things on the supply chain and so on. But I would submit that we have something even broader than that makes our life more difficult in this day and age. One is enrichment technology has fundamentally, and its dissemination has fundamentally changed the equation. So it's no longer this nuclear reactor that you have to build and that you ultimately, so that's a second development, which we had seen initially in Pakistan and then in Iran, obviously in Brazil, but it's spreading elsewhere in North Korea, and more than one plant in North Korea and so on. But I think there are two other things that are happening at the same time, and that they also complicate this tracking question that you've raised, Fiona. One is there is the breakdown of the superpower consensus on non-proliferation. A hell of a lot of the success in non-proliferation was based on the superpowers working on this together. And now it's a topic of such great rivalry where China isn't willing to make North Korea an exemption to the rivalry and so on, its policy and so on. We've seen the collapse of the Budapest Memorandum legacy in terms of how it affects people's perception of whether Ukraine did the right thing by giving up and so on. But finally, I think the AUKUS deal tells us something more, which is that the priority assigned to non-proliferation considerations in the overall relationship is also diminishing. So if that is the case, and you are relegating those types of considerations of non-proliferation, and there is more technology available, and some of the technology has greater peaceful or at least not illegitimate uses, for example, in SMRs or in floating reactors, or in the US is now for the first time deploying commercially more than 5% enriched uranium into a nuclear power plant. So we are dealing here with a fundamentally different realities, which is why we need the brain power of Vipin to keep at it rather than take a break.
Eliza.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you so much for the question. I have an answer that is quite similar to Ellie's. I'll come at it from a different perspective a little bit. So globalization in itself is not actually such a big deal, I would say. But globalization, when you have countries like US, Russia, and China involved in superpower competition, is a problem. Globalization can be reined in with institutions. And I've written about the NSG and how it does that, starting from the assumption and showing that hedgers are actually the main beneficiaries of a breakdown in market regulation. And we kind of see that breakdown now as well. So I would say that, yes, the balance point for hedgers is changing, but not because of globalization as much as because the US, China, and Russia cannot put proliferation at the top of their security agenda and instead are bickering and fighting about all sorts of other things, which to them are very important. But at the same time, if we think about the destructive power of nuclear weapons, I think it should give them pause and perhaps force them to reconsider. So I would like to echo Ellie's point about Vipin and turning his intellectual power to these kinds of questions, because I'm sure he would have a very interesting answer. So looking forward to hearing his thoughts on this.
You guys are going to kill me. I'm too old for this. I agree with these comments. I think that my own view, and this is sort of independent of the book, but I think that technological evolution benefits both hunter and prey. And I don't think we have good insight, or we're equipped at this point to know what the balance is going to look like. But as Ellie and Eliza both suggest, the politics around this are really interesting. This idea of sheltered hedgers, I actually think that is going to be a very prominent feature in the emerging nuclear. We're already seeing it in the Middle East, in Asia, and establishing the basis of a potential nuclear weapons program. Maybe easier with sort of the emerging technologies and the diffusion of it, and also the emergence of these great power patrons who are now willing to tolerate it in ways, because the consensus is starting to break down, that they previously had not. As those states flirt with the idea of active weaponization, we're putting a lot of stock that our improved intelligence and surveillance capabilities are going to be able to catch them, right? Especially if they're outside of our block. If we're sheltering them, then all bets are off. But if it's a Chinese sheltered state or a Russian sheltered state, will we be able to catch them? And then what do? Do you risk a major power war with the other patron to stop the state? I mean, I think we're, I don't want to end this on such a dismal note, but I think we're entering a new era of proliferation where our standard models of I want the bomb, I'm going to go get it, to I want the bomb, the US is going to stop me, is now becoming I may want the bomb, somebody might help me, and if I decide one day I'm going to go get it, I've got somebody who's going to protect me. That's a whole different landscape. And I think that is increasingly a potential and could be a prominent feature of the proliferation landscape going forward. And you've got all of this operating, in an environment where the superpower collusion, Andrew Ko, Jane Vayman wrote this, really important article on how the NPT was essentially, and the enforcement of the NPT was superpower collusion between the US and Soviet Union. And then there was great power consensus that we didn't really want to see, the spread of nuclear weapons very far beyond that is breaking down. And so you could see the emergence of certainly more hedgers. And then I think one difficulty, and then I'll stop and move on, is we may not know when a hedger has decided to go. In the past, we've had pretty good eyes on that. But if you're a sheltered hedger, those who oppose your weaponization may not have good eyes on whether you've decided to go all the way. And so that becomes sort of, when does a state become nuclear, becomes even a more difficult and challenging problem because we may not know. So,
but and may not be able to act on. Vipin,
exactly.
And may not be able to act on because
you may not be
no consensus. Unlike an international agency that monitors fissile materials, there is no legitimate agency that has the mandate to track weaponization activity. So it's so contentious.
Correct.
All right, so we are a little bit over time. If my three panelists will be willing to answer one more question in a very quick final round, then I will just field out three from the audience very quickly and then wrap things up. But I wanted to make sure that a couple more audience members had their questions answered. So I'll direct three questions to each of the panelists and ask you to have really brief 1-minute answers if you can. So the question for that I'd like Ellie, if he wouldn't mind answering, comes from Michael Crepom, who notes that Vipin seems to find continuity in trends, tactics, and strategies. What's new? Is it that the hedgers are friends of the United States? I'm going to pose the question to Vipin from Melinda Migoda, who asks, does this framing of sheltered pursuit and hiding help us to understand a state once it goes nuclear and the pace of its vertical proliferation? So in some ways, this is looking at the connections between Vipin, your first and your second book projects. And finally, I was hoping Eliza might take a stab at the question Gary Sampson has posed. And he asks, the book states that most sheltered pursuers achieve a nuclear capability, and that in one example, China preferred a nuclear DPRK to an unstable one. How can patrons manage clients, given that I know this is something that your work has looked in extensive detail from and not from a US perspective? So if we can have a minute each, and then we'll wrap everything up. But thanks, and we'll start with Ellie.
Thank you. Well, we miss Michael Crepons in the administration, but that issue aside, which makes the difference, I would say the following. I think there is a combination of three things that is marking the current period, beyond the things I already talked about. I think there is somewhat of a sense that the process of advancing towards creeping number of more nuclear states and more advanced nuclear hedgers is becoming inevitable. That the price of stopping it and the cost and the risks associated with stopping it have become much, much higher. And there is, and that the possibility for collaborating to achieving it is also is also fraying. And between those three things, we have one more thing that I think is in the midst of this. If North Korea got nuclear weapons and is by and large behaving itself, if Pakistan was able to suppress some of its worst instincts and not use nuclear weapons, maybe it's not the end of the world. So I think that the level of determination to stop proliferation, at least in terms of advanced hedging, is diminishing in all kinds of interesting ways. And as a result, we may not get, and to conclude with what Vipin had said, we may not end up with many more nuclear states in the immediate future, but we will definitely end up, in my judgment, with more advanced nuclear hedgers. And the difficulty of figuring out a policy of trying to keep them from going another step forward.
We might turn to Eliza next, and then Vipin, you'll have the almost final word.
Thanks so much. This is a great question. I'm sorry for the self-promotion as well. I have a piece coming out in the next few weeks about this, not specifically about sheltered pursuers, but how patrons manage clients. I think once a patron has clients, it ends up having a headache. So they have to figure out ways to deal with them that are not going to help them, or at least superpowers would not want to help their clients get nuclear weapons. And they also don't want to tell them not to get nuclear weapons because that's going to antagonize them. So there's a very fine line that patrons have to walk to satisfy their clients and to keep them non-nuclear. I would argue that in the cases that Vipin talks about, there seems to be a lot that patrons can do with deterrence, type 2 deterrence. They seem to be using things like assistance, all sorts of incentives, all sorts of political, military, economic gains that then they can withdraw if they feel that the client is not going the right direction. So thanks for the question.
Vipin.
Fiona cheated and let me be able to plug my first and second books at the same time. So I do think the process of developing sort of the initial nuclear weapon capability is divorced from the vertical proliferation question. I mean, I think how you get there to the finish line and then what race you decide to run afterwards have different considerations. And so that's sort of how I felt comfortable and how I approach sort of hiving off and keeping the two questions and the two books separate. I sort of did them in reverse order, the strategy, nuclear strategy first, and then how do I get there second. But obviously, sequentially, the proliferation process comes first. I think we've seen hiders once, South Africa is really the only one that succeeded, and then South Africa gave them up. But I think if you had a hider go now and succeed, all bets are off as to what their ultimate nuclear strategy will look like. It totally depends on sort of, what they're trying to deter, how sophisticated, you have an initial buffer. Once you get nuclear weapons, right, you could follow the Pakistani model, which is you start with uranium and then move to plutonium once you have that sort of insurance. North Korea sort of, goes both ways. And so, we've seen all types of strategies of proliferation lead to all types of sort of nuclear strategies afterwards. So I don't think there's strong correlation between them. And that actually works well because then you can sort of treat these processes as separate. But I want to take the time to thank everybody in the audience who came, spent an hour with us. I really want to thank Carnegie NPP, Fiona, Eliza, and Ellie for doing this, Toby for organizing it, Aaron for taking care of all the logistics expertly. And I hope everybody enjoys and finds some use in the book and doesn't fall asleep while reading it.
All right, Vipin, thank you for doing the vote of thanks almost completely for me. I was going to thank everybody as well, so I'll add mine to Vipin's. But the other thing that I really want to do is to thank you for contributing this book and to congratulate you on getting it out. It's an inspiration for those of us who are earlier on in our academic careers, and I hope that for those of you who are the next generation of nuclear policy experts who are out there listening, you're inspired to go research this question of sheltered hedging, and some of the other questions that have come up. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will look forward to engaging in more conversations with everybody else. Thanks for sticking with us a little over time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.